All right, so I want to thank all of you for coming here tonight. These webinars are kind of built so you could be at the comfort of your own home or the Air Force Base or whatever, so you guys could be comfortable. Tonight we have Dr. Peter Kolb, and as an extension agent, I really value Peter because he is a plethora of information on trees. A large part of my job duties is to help people with shelter belts, but also going to visit their homes and gardens and looking at their trees. And sometimes I get to talk to Peter and ask him and run things past him as well. And just the amount of information that Peter has is phenomenal about any type of tree. So I'm very excited to have Peter here tonight. So Peter is with Montana State University Extension, but he is housed in Missoula at the Forestry College over there. So Peter, I am going to mute myself and stop my video, and I'm going to give you the floor. So thank you so much, Peter.
So, question, Rose, has my
Yes.
presentation shown up on the screen?
Yes, it has. It's the first slide says tree cutting not for everyone, and somebody looks like they cut a tree and hit their house.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, now I
Perfect.
cannot see the chat, so if people write questions in the chat, Rose,
Yeah,
can you bring them to my attention or narrate them or whatever?
you betcha. So do you want me to interrupt you as they come in, or do you want to do it at the end?
No, interrupt, because if it's a
Okay.
question about a relevant slide, rather than scrolling all the way back through, we can address it as it comes up. And I'm fine for questions during the program. Make this as interactive as possible.
Perfect.
You know, that said, I have a lot of slides, so we should take up the time pretty well.
Awesome.
But I'm certainly willing to answer any questions that might be out there.
Yep, I will interrupt you and ask questions as they come up. And if you guys want, you can put your questions in the chat. Or if you find a time that you can unmute yourself, then you can unmute yourself and talk to Peter as well. So I give you the floor.
All right. Well, thank you, and nice to meet everybody. As Rose indicated, I'm kind of a tree person, and I have been working planting trees, pruning trees, and forestry, etc., for oh gosh, well over 50 years now. And so I'm lucky because I like trees, and that's kind of my passion, my interest. So Rose asked me to talk a little bit about tree care, pruning, planting, maintenance things. We'll kind of start with a little bit of a background of different tree species and in the broad category. We have the broadleaf, usually deciduous trees, and the coniferous or needle trees. We do have one needle tree species in Montana, western larch, that is deciduous. It loses its needles every year, but that's pretty restricted to northwest Montana. We have a few broadleaf evergreen shrubs, Oregon grape being one of them. In some places, holly might survive. But that's about it. You know, there's other places like California or the Southeast that has live oak that keep their leaves for many, many years. Okay, so I'll start with some real basic review, and this works for all plants. That basically the leaves are there to absorb light and carbon dioxide and produce sugar. Now, in the process, when the humidity is less than 100%, they also lose water vapor. So, you know, if you're interested in the chemistry, it's 6 CO2s plus 12 water molecules produces 1 glucose molecule, and 6 oxygen molecules and 6 water molecules. But this is a process that goes both ways. So when there's sunlight, the trees photosynthesize and produce sugar, and when it's dark, trees eat the sugar. But also during the day they eat the sugar, but when the sunlight is out there, they're producing more sugar than they eat. Okay, and it's real interesting because what makes trees unique is they also produce woody tissue, and that woody tissue is basically cellulose. Now, if we look at the biochemistry of it, starch is simply sugar molecules, glucose molecules, that are attached to each other in a similar pattern, so that right chain. Cellulose is also glucose molecules that is attached to each other, but the oxygen bonds between them are opposite. So every molecule attaches upside down to the next one. And it's real interesting because starch is very soluble, and cellulose is incredibly hard to crack once you have it. That's the woody tissue that we see. And so cellulose and starch are chemically identical. It's just how those molecules are put together. Probably more than you wanted to know, but it's kind of an interesting factoid out there. So the only part of the tree that produces sugar is, or any plant, are the leaves that have chlorophyll and perform photosynthesis. The rest of the tree and even the leaves at night consume that sugar in what's called respiration. And as long as photosynthesis exceeds respiration, we grow fruits, we grow bigger plants, or we grow woody tissue and seeds. Okay, so a little bit more into the details of how this works. If we look at a cross-section of a broadleaf, and this is trees, and a lot of vegetable plants are similar, except they may not have this structure called guard cells around their stomata. Stomata are where the carbon dioxide gets absorbed from the air into the leaf, and carbon dioxide is only 0.04% of air. Okay, so about 80% of air is nitrogen gas, and the rest is oxygen, CO2, and a whole lot of inert gases. So as the leaf cells absorb the carbon dioxide, that depletes the carbon dioxide in these chambers inside the pores on the leaves, the stomates, and just through diffusion from low concentration or from high concentration to low concentration, that's how leaves absorb CO2 and use it for photosynthesis. Now, the inside of a leaf is wet, so the air inside a leaf is 100% humid. The air outside the leaf, when it's less than 100% humid, which is most of the summer in Montana, that water gets drawn out of the leaf. And since a water molecule is about a third of the size of a CO2 molecule, leaves lose water a lot faster than they absorb CO2. Usually it's a ratio of 1.6, so they lose water at 1.6 times the rate at which leaves can absorb carbon dioxide. So water loss is a big thing. Okay, so just to go back to this diagram, so we have photosynthesis on the left side and the right side, and sugar then builds everything else. The function of the leaves is to produce energy. The function of the branch, the stems, is to transport water and sugar. Because the stem and the root system consumes that sugar. The root system's function is to absorb water and soil nutrients to allow for photosynthesis to take place. Okay. Now, usually on most plants, and especially trees, when they're younger, the amount of leaf area is very similar to the amount of root area that's out there. And that's because the roots, if you're in a dry area, low humidities, and your plants are losing a lot of water, you'd think they'd want as big a root system as possible. But the root system has to be fed sugar. And the only place that sugar is produced is in the leaves. So to produce more sugar, the tree or plant has to put on more leaf area. But when it puts on more leaf area, it loses more water. So every site has a very, very careful balance between leaf area and root area. And if one suffers, the other suffers. So that comes into play when we're pruning trees or we're transplanting trees. And to give you an idea, so here's a pippin apple that was very carefully excavated, and you can see that the top portion, the fine twigs and branch area, is about analogous to the root area, but it's really the leaf area. So stems can get big, branches can get big, but they might not use as much sugar. So it's the leaf area that produces sugar and loses water is very closely tied into the root area that consumes the sugar but acquires the water out of the soil. Okay, so as I mentioned, when it's dark out and there's no light, photosynthesis stops, and the tree or any plant has to consume stored sugar just in maintenance respiration. And so there's two kinds of respiration. Maintenance is just to keep the cells alive. Works the same way in our bodies. We have to consume food to keep our cells alive. And then there's also growth respiration. That's what allows the cells to divide and grow bigger. So when we're young, we're doing a lot of growth respiration because we're growing bigger, hopefully. Once we reach the mature age, we do less growth respiration unless we put on unwanted growth for most of us. But for trees or vegetables, that growth respiration now produces seeds or fruit. And so, excuse me, depending on the time of year, growth respiration can be consuming a lot of the sugar that the leaves are producing. And your productivity, whether it's tomatoes or carrot roots or anything like that, is very closely linked to how well the plant can photosynthesize, which is linked to water availability and nutrient loading, especially in garden vegetables. The trees are a lot more conservative with nutrients. They don't need as much as the garden vegetables, but any kind of growth respiration requires a lot of soil nutrients because you're building a lot of cell structure and cell walls and the structural growth of the plant. Okay, conifers are like any other leaves, but they have needles. And the reason the needles are the shape they are is because most conifers are designed to grow in very dry areas. And the shape of the conifer, the cross section, as you can see in this one, is triangular. And that's actually an adaptive structure to reflect much of the light that hits it, because full photosynthesis in a C3 photosynthetic pathway pretty much maxes out at half of full sunlight at summer solstice. So sunlight intensity changes as the Earth shifts its axis going around the sun. But at summer solstice, was that June 21st, at midday, plants can only use half of the sunlight that's hitting them, unless they're C4. So corn is a C4, cheatgrass is a C4. And the more light you give a C4 plant, the faster they grow. The problem is their optimum temperature is around 80 to 90 degrees, whereas a C3 plant, the optimum temperature is closer to 72 degrees. So for C4 plants to grow, like your corn, it needs a higher temperature and it needs full sunlight. There are no C4 plants or trees in this latitude that can survive. There's some in the tropics. All right. And leaf structure can change based on what kind of light intensity it develops in. So full sunlight, as we measure sunlight in the form of photons, which are massless light particles. And full sunlight at summer solstice is about 2,000 times 10 to the 21st power photons per meter squared per second. So 2,000 plus 21 zeros behind it. So that's a lot of light particles. However, when you're in the shade of a tree, you'd be surprised that the sunlight you're getting under in the shade of a tree is maybe 10 times 10 to the 21st power. So less than 1/10 of 1% of full sunlight. And so that's very inefficient for many plants, which is why they can't grow in the shade. Trees can develop sun leaves and shade leaves. The sun leaves have a thicker leaf, can utilize all that sun's energy. The shade leaves are much thinner. They're designed to capture every little light particle that makes it through. But if shade leaves are suddenly put in the sun, they'll sunburn. And that's why if you're growing plants or trees in the shade and then you suddenly transplant them in full sunlight, you'll often see the leaves yellow or turn brown, and they're basically sunburning because they can't handle the energy load that full sunlight is giving them. So here's a ponderosa pine cross section. The needles, you can see they're triangular in shape. They're designed to reflect half the sunlight that hits them. Okay, this is a grand fir needle structure. They grow well in the shade, so their leaf architecture, needle architecture, is designed to absorb very minimal light particles. Now, in most of Montana, grand fir won't grow because that ability to absorb all that sunlight, the bad side of that is they lose a lot of water. And so in Great Falls or central Montana, grand fir will lose water at a faster rate than they photosynthesize, and they'll die of drought stress, even if you're watering them day and night. So when trees have a leaf architecture designed for shade, they have a much harder time growing on dry sites and full sunlight sites. Okay, the way conifers grow is very different than the way broadleaf trees grow, or deciduous trees. Also, we have a lot of different ways of separating trees. Conifer means closed-in seeds, so cone producing. Angiosperms are flower producing, and most of our broadleaf trees are angiosperms. Most of our evergreens are conifers. Okay, but typically the way they grow is, if we go back 2 slides real quick, at the end of the growing season, the conifers will form buds. They have a terminal bud. I don't know if my pointer's showing up here in just a moment here. I think I can use a laser pointer. Here we go. So where we have a terminal bud, that bud is designed to grow taller, and the lateral buds are designed to grow sideways. And the terminal bud produces a hormone that makes all the lateral buds grow sideways. But the other interesting thing on conifers is that in the fall they set a bud, and inside that bud are all the preformed needles of the following year. So the number of needles is determined by the previous year. Okay, so let's scooch on down here again. And so when that bud bursts, you get the terminal leader with the predetermined needles on it, and all the lateral buds do the same thing. And so we can age a young conifer by counting the whorls of branches. So every second year, lateral buds will often develop very strongly. So if we count the whorls of lateral branches, that gives us the age of the tree for a conifer. Sometimes in older trees, it's a little harder to see those. Now, the other thing about a conifer is that they hold on to their needles for 3 to 5 years. So we look at this diagram of a cross section. Here's the bud. So this would be in the fall. This is the bud with the predetermined little needles in there. And this is this past summer's needle growth. Then there's usually a little gap, and then there's the needles from a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years, 5 years. Now, conifer needles are designed to retain water, so they produce a waxy coating on them. And if it's a real strong wax, that's what makes the needles blue, like Colorado blue spruce. It's simply a wax coating. You can rub it off if you want to. But that wax coating, after a couple of years, plugs the stomates, the pores in the needles. So about year 3 to 5, those pores can no longer absorb carbon dioxide. The needle suffers a major energy deficit, and the tree drops those needles. And so we move on. So here's a ponderosa pine branch. And so there's, this is midsummer, fully developed new needles from this year. And those are the needles from last year, needles from 3 years ago. And there's a little bit of a gap in there, but you also see a difference in needle size on there. And ponderosa pines are great because they're record keepers. When I run into properties where certain trees are having troubles, I always try to find a ponderosa pine because it tells me what's been going on. And so on this one, if we look 3 years ago, these are fully formed, developed ponderosa pine needles, which means they had good conditions, enough energy, enough water, and they grew to their full potential. If we look at last year's needles, you see that they're very stunted and closer together. That's an indicator that last year this tree was suffering drought, and it didn't have enough water for those needles to fully grow to their potential, and so they're stunted. This year, conditions were better. Needles are longer, but because the number of needles were formed during the drought year, they're a lot closer together and they're a little more stunted. And in an extreme case, here we go. This is a ponderosa pine, a 15-foot ponderosa pine that was transplanted. And again, this is late summer, August. So this is this year's growth. Very stunted needles, indicating severe water stress because the tree didn't have, it was transplanted, so it lost most of its root system. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. It couldn't absorb enough water, so the needles were very stunted. This is last year's needles. You see how short they are? There's lots of them, good elongation on the branch, but the needles are very stunted. This is when the tree was excavated using a root spade and then put in a root ball. Then the year before, so this is 1, 2, so 3 years ago, the tree was still growing in its natural setting. This is what the needles should look like. So I can tell exactly when the tree was dug up, when it was planted, and how well is it doing now? And it's obviously not doing very well because of those stunted needles. Okay, so
Peter, we have a question from Mel's from Air Force Base. They're asking, can a leaf photosynthesize on a cloudy day from the UV rays that cause sunburn, for example?
okay, so photosynthesis, chlorophyll, doesn't use ultraviolet light very much. Okay, it uses mainly blue light, which is close to ultraviolet light, and red light. And that's why leaves are green. It reflects most of the green wavelengths in the spectrum. So there's a photosystem 1, a photosystem 2. One uses blue light, one uses red light. But on a cloudy day, if we go out with a light meter, we have almost the same sunlight intensity as a non-cloudy day. The light has just been scattered. Okay, so we're not getting direct sunlight rays like laser beams hitting those leaves. we're like hitting a laser beam that's hitting a crystal disco ball, and you're getting light penetration from multiple aspects and directions. But trees grow really well on cloudy days, and that's why also you'll sunburn on a cloudy day, because water will absorb some ultraviolet light, but not enough to keep you from sunburning. So I don't know if that answers the question. If not, throw another one out there, and we'll address that. Okay, so most trees have reflective mechanisms to ultraviolet light, and there's 3 levels of ultraviolet light: ultraviolet C, B, and A. So B is mainly what sunburns us. C is what we see in a black light, and A doesn't make it to our atmosphere, which is a good thing, because ultraviolet A is DNA disruptive. So anything it hits, it kills. It breaks apart molecular cell structure. So if you're in the International Space Station and you don't have special protection against UVC, you're going to die. I mean, you're going to get skin cancer. Your skin will melt off of you because of the UVC. All right. So moving on, deciduous trees grow a little different. Every species is a little different. It's very hard to age them based on their branch structure, because they can develop multiple branches and multiple crowns at the same time. So if we age these based on leaf scars, so there's a 5-year-old tree, there's a 6-year-old here, there's a 7-year-old tree. So they're putting on a foot to foot and a half growth, and this is going to vary by tree species. But very hard to age these trees just by the growth architecture of the tree. Okay, and of course they're deciduous, and so their strategy is very, very different. They don't take energy to keep their leaves alive. They grow throwaway leaves, so they grow them fast in the spring. They're total solar cells, and so they absorb an awful lot of energy, but they lose a lot more water comparative to a conifer tree, which is why most of Montana, there are no native broadleaf trees unless you're in a riparian area. So cottonwoods, any of the deciduous trees, green ash, etc., box elder, are growing in riparian areas where they can have their roots in water. As soon as you get away from that, you don't have deciduous trees, with the exception of quaking aspen. And this is actually a quaking aspen. And what you see on the quaking aspen, they have these flat leaf attachments called petioles. And their mechanism to stay cool is the petioles are flat, so any slight breeze will cause the leaves to shift their orientation. And so that keeps them from sunburning and getting too hot, because they're in the sun, they're in the shade, they're in the sun. That fluttering is a cooling mechanism that takes them out of full sunlight, that allows their photosynthetic structure to recover. Then they're in the full sunlight, they get a burst of energy, then they're in the shade again to recover from that burst of energy. And that's why quaking aspens are really the only deciduous species that can grow well in the drier, hotter climates of Montana. I mean, there's some shrubs that do that. They stay short because they don't have to transport water as far. But a tall tree, there's a delay in the water transport, and we'll get into that here shortly. So here's tree architecture. What makes a tree is that it forms woody tissue over multiple years. Okay, and the growth on a tree only occurs in this thin layer under the bark called the cambium. Okay, and so during the dormant time of the year, like a couple months ago, that layer of cambium is very, very thin. It's maybe 2-3 cells thick. It's like onion skin. But this time of year, when sugar is being mobilized, starch is being converted to sugar, that cambium, the cells start to divide, and it can be 80 to 300 cells thick. And it grows a layer to the outside, and it grows a layer to the inside. So the outside layer is called the phloem. Its function is to transport sugar water from the leaves down to the rest of the tree. So think of it as a straw network, and these are very big diameter straws, because sugar water doesn't move through small spaces very well. Now, to the inside, it grows 2 layers. This is the sapwood, also called xylem tissue. And the function of the sapwood is mainly to transport water. Okay, and the reason we have rings in there is in the spring, when the sapwood, that cell structure is growing really well, those cells are bigger in diameter, so bigger diameter straws to transport water when it's available, and the leaves are growing, so the demand is higher. And then as summer progresses, water availability becomes less. The leaves aren't growing anymore, so the demand is less. So that straw network becomes smaller in diameter, and that gives a darker color. So it's really springwood, summerwood. Springwood is a light colored wood. the summer wood is a dark colored wood, and in the fall, when the tree goes dormant, when it gets below freezing, the tree can't grow anymore, so there is no winter wood or anything like that. Now, the sapwood width or thickness is also very proportional to the leaf area. Okay, because the sapwood is alive. The tree has to keep it alive by feeding it sugar. So it's only going to keep enough sapwood alive as it needs to get adequate water. As the sapwood gets older, it lets it die, and that turns into heartwood, which is dead. And the heartwood is often discolored because trees don't go to the bathroom the way we think of it is, think of animals do. They deposit all their waste material in the dying sapwood, and that's why it's usually darker in color. And sometimes that sapwood, that waste material, are toxins, and those toxins are also bad for fungi and insects, and that's why the heartwood often doesn't decay as quickly as the sapwood. So if you're buying lumber from Douglas fir, for example, the heartwood is much more decay resistant than the sapwood is. Okay, so now some species don't put a lot of toxins in the heartwood, so the true firs, grand fir, etc. doesn't, but some put really toxic stuff in there. So cedar, so you might have cedar closets or cedar chest because it's full of terpenes and toxins that are toxic to insects. And so we made chests and closets out of cedar because we wanted to protect our linens and our cottons and our wools from insects that like to eat that material, and they go into a cedar closet and they die from the toxins. So the question comes up, well, is it bad for humans? And the answer is, you bet it is. And that's why we want to aerate out your house. But if your house smells really strongly of cedar, you're breathing in carcinogens that really aren't good for you. And, you know, they have this trick about cooking salmon on cedar planks because it gives off a flavor. You know, I scratch my head about that one. I sure as heck don't want to eat a salmon that's been cooked on a cedar plank that's being impregnated by wood toxins. So there are plenty of toxins in wood that we don't want to eat or breathe. But in the old days, it was a balance. You know, we wanted to keep the bugs out of our clothing. So, you know, that was much better than breathing cedar, and you just got to aerate out your house from time to time. Okay, so as a review, the sapwood, the xylem tissue transports water from the roots up to the leaves, and the outer layer, that phloem tissue, transports sugar down to the root system. Now, we tap sugar maples in the spring because sugar maples also store a lot of sugar in the root system. So in the spring, when the leaves are growing, there's a very strong flow of sugar from the root system up to the leaves. And if we just score that bark a little bit, it'll drip out that sugary water that's supposed to grow the leaves, and we can collect that and boil it down to maple syrup of a ratio of about 100 to 1. So 100 gallons of sap makes 1 gallon of syrup. So pretty dilute stuff. But you can do that with any tree. The problem is that it's better with deciduous trees because they're pumping sugar water up to the growing leaves. Conifers don't do that, and you're going to get pitch, which is really toxic stuff. You don't want to eat that. But some trees, the sugar is combined with other things, and it doesn't taste particularly good. So up in Alaska, or particularly good. Up in Alaska, they'll actually tap aspen trees and sometimes birch trees to make that syrup as well. Okay, so cross section of the way all that works. So here's sapwood, heartwood. So the phloem transports sugar down to the tree, to the branches, the sapwood, the root system to feed that and keep it alive, and down the branches as well. And the sapwood transports water up. Okay, so we have a plumbing system with directional flow on these trees. Now, and so here's a cross section, for example, of a ponderosa pine. And so for the first 69 years, it had a small leaf area, very, very minimal carbon production, photosynthesis, why the rings are so narrow. Then that tree had the trees around it removed, which gave it access to more light, more water. You can see the increased growth rate. And as that tree got crowded by other trees, that growth rate slowed down again. Then the trees around it were thinned out again. And again, you saw the increase in growth rate. And the cambium is right under the bark, and the phloem is the inner bark that's there. And the living sapwood, its function is to transport water, store a little bit of starch. Heartwood has no function other than structure. And so that kind of gives you an idea about, in forestry, we of course want to grow thick stems as quickly as possible. So this is a forestry setting where we're giving the tree more light, more water by thinning the trees and allowing them to grow bigger, faster, and give us enough wood to cut 2x4s and boards from. So we go back to this picture. Now, the reason I show you this is because this water flow and sugar flow is only positive one time of the year, and it's in the spring when there's adequate water and there's a lot of sugar being mobilized in the tree to grow new leaves, new needles, and eventually seeds or fruit or something like that. As soon as that spring growth is over, this water gets sucked up the tree by the water loss from the leaves, okay? And say on an 80-degree day at 30% relative humidity, that suction of dry air on a leaf is equivalent to 2,000 pounds per square inch, okay? So a Dyson vacuum cleaner, which puts out a pretty good suction, is sucking at about 60 to 70 pounds per square inch. Dry air at 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 30% relative humidity, is producing a suction of 2,000 pounds per square inch, okay? And that's what's drawing the water up to the leaves. Now, what happens when you poke a hole into a straw? And that operates the same way, okay? You're creating a negative pressure or a lesser pressure than atmospheric pressure, and that pushes the water or liquid up into your mouth. Well, if we poke a hole into the straw network in a tree, what happens is you get an air embolism in there, okay? Water or air gets sucked into there because you have this vascular system where the leaves are sucking water up through the stem like a big straw. And when you get an air embolism in there, that vascular tissue doesn't work anymore. So you have a blockage. So now all of a sudden you have a straw that's only functioning 2/3 or half as well as it should, which means your leaves aren't getting enough water, which means a lot of leaves are going to die or operate at less than peak efficiency. Okay, and if that embolism and some tree species can push air pockets out, some cannot. So cottonwood cannot control embolisms. We call it cavitation, catastrophic cavitation. So an injury on a cottonwood, you get a huge dead pocket in there, big air pocket, and it really restricts water flow up to the leaves, and then part of the crown dies back. So crown dieback is an indicator of water stress, okay? Our native tree species that grow on drier sites, quaking aspen, Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, have a much better way of sealing off any kind of a breach in their vascular system, and so they can stop these air embolisms from happening a lot quicker, okay? So here's a quaking aspen, for example, a cross section, where the branch died, and an embolism occurred, and the tree sealed it off. We call this compartmentalization. And so a lot of more robust broadleaf trees and even conifers can do this, but there still is this blockage, okay? And so if we're pruning off branches on a tree, we're creating embolisms like this. And the idea is then if we create a wound, want to create a wound that heals as quickly as possible, that will stop the embolism from forming, and will then form live sapwood over this pocket, and then the tree can eventually resume normal function by regrowing and restoring its full plumbing system. Okay, if we look at this, gosh, I don't even know, this is a silver maple, and you can see where the branch attaches, there's this swelling right here, okay? And that's true on most deciduous broadleaf trees. You'll get this swelling because it's a structural strengthening that holds the torque of the branch, okay? And when we want to prune this branch off, we want to cut as close to tissue that's going to stay alive so that living tissue will grow over it. So here's a relatively good pruning cut, and this was done a year ago. So in 1 year, you can see this growth around the outside of the cut. It's called callus tissue. And in a series of years, that will grow over this pruning cut and restore sapwood function to that side of the tree. Now, clearly, if we prune off a branch here and cut this one and cut this one and cut this one, we're creating multiple air pockets and we're creating a major blockage right in the same spot. So one of those rules of pruning is to try not to prune off too many branches in the same spot on the stem. If you stair step your way up, and if you're doing a reduction cut, and we'll get into that a little bit more, that's okay. But all similar cuts all in the same place can cause a real restriction in water flow up through the stem. Okay, so on this branch, we want to cut as close as possible to the stem where living tissue will stay alive. And in this swelling, water flow and sugar flow will continue. So we want to cut right about here at the edge of the swelling. If we cut flush with the stem, you can see we're going to create a wound twice as big as it needs to be. Okay, and so we want to avoid that. We want to create as small a wound as possible. But we do not want to leave a stub sticking out. Now, quick side note, conifers will pitch, they produce copious amounts of pitch, okay? Pitch is not sap. Sap is the sugar water that feeds the tree. Pitch is simply a defensive compound. It's toxic. It's got terpenes in there. You wouldn't feel good eating it. It's what pine sol is made out of, okay? We use it as a cleaning substance because it's toxic to microbes and things like that. And so most conifers will produce a lot of pitch that will seal that wound off, block the embolism, and keep bugs and insects and diseases out most of the time, okay? So there's a year later. And you can see this new callus growth. So this is actually 3 years later. So that's first year, second year, third year callus growth is just starting on there. And usually a wound that's 2 to 3 inches in diameter will heal completely shut if it's done correctly in 3 to 5 years. And I'll show you pictures of that. Okay, now when we're removing branches, if they're small branches, we can just use a nipper, lopping shears, and make one cut to take them off. And again, this is the ideal cut. You see the swelling. So we start a little closer to the stem, slight outward angle. If this is a bigger branch and we start to cut it off, we get about to this point and the weight will tear the rest of the branch off, creating a huge wound. So we use a 2 or 3 step process. First, we want to take the weight off about a foot out from the branch. You can either do one cut or you can do an undercut. If it's a really big branch, do an undercut, then cut from the top. You'll get halfway through and then the branch will simply fall off, rather than bending over, splitting the branch and tearing off, okay? Once we have the torque off, then we make the final cut. All right, so here's examples where an undercut was not done. Started cutting from the top, got to about there, and it tore the rest of this out. Same right there, they kind of didn't get it quite off, and then they had made a back cut on there. And it's okay, it's not ideal, because this callus tissue does not like to grow over irregularities. It grows best over a nice smooth surface. So this bottom part is kind of stalled right here. And it has to wait for the rest of this to grow all the way over this cut before it seals itself off. If it was a smooth cut, it would seal up in half the time. All right. Now, if we don't get the cut right, so here we're cutting outside that swelling area. So the swelling is right here, too far out. We call these coat hangers, hat hangers, because pruning is hard work. Got a good place to hang your hat or your coat. Problem is that vascular tissue, water flow and sugar flow will only go out to the edge of the swelling. It won't go any further, okay? And so these cuts stay open, they crack. You're going to get all sorts of fungi in there. In this case, a canker fungi, so a fungi that feeds on that sugar-rich cambium layer, got in through this cut because it didn't heal real well, and it spread underneath the bark and eventually created the whole side of the tree to die back. Now, young tree can overcome that. You want to clean out, like I did here, clean off all the dead bark so it doesn't collect water, doesn't stay moist, that insects and fungi like. You want the sun to hit it, you want it to dry out, and this callus tissue will eventually grow over it. This same tree still has a scar. It's healed over. I took this picture many years ago. I've tracked this tree. It's healed over, but it still has a big scar in there and has now some decay in there that collects water, and in the winter when the water freezes, it'll crack the stem open and create a frost crack. Okay, so big branches, same thing. This stub will just die, and you have this big rotten chunk on the side of the tree. And once you get rot in there, the callus tissue has a hard time growing over that because it curls into the cavity, and it won't grow over it. You need a solid surface for that tissue to grow over. This will collect water, and it will create decay in the center of the tree, so that heartwood will start to decay. And so here's a cross section of a horse chestnut where these branches were pruned off right across from each other, a lot of dead area. Took a long time to heal, and you got decay fungi in there. And so you can see right here, there is a real minimal amount of sapwood to conduct water, whereas up here, there's a fair amount. So the top of this tree isn't getting enough water. It's not photosynthesizing, producing enough sugar. These wounds take a lot longer to grow. The tree is stunted. It won't grow as well. You can get decay in here, which can cause rot, which can cause the tree to structurally fail. All right. Here's a cut that was done really well. And you'll know a year later when you see the callus tissue growing around it. So this is about as far out as I would dare to go. And 4 years later, voila, it's healed over. over time, the sapwood growth above and below this will catch up to it, and you won't even notice that there's a knot in there. Now, this kind of mechanism can be a problem if you pound a nail into a tree or any kind of metal, or you fill a cavity with concrete, which is actually a technique for getting the callus growth to grow over a rotten area. But once it grows over, you don't see it anymore, and then later on the tree has to come down, and you hit that metal or concrete with a saw. It's not good. So the bigger the cut, the longer it takes, the more you need to maintain that cut. So the question always comes up, to use pruning paint or not use pruning paint. And there was a study done back in the East Coast where they found that the pruning paint seals the fungi in there, and you get more decay with pruning paint than if you were not to use pruning paint. Hence the recommendation, don't use pruning paint. But the East Coast, Midwest has 100% humidity all summer long, okay? Fungal spores live for days, float around, travel great distances. In Montana, at 30% relative humidity in the summer, fungal spore will go about 4 feet and die, okay? It needs a humid environment. They're not drought resistant at all. So the biggest issue here is if the sapwood dries out, your air embolism, your air pocket gets bigger, plus the splitting and cracking of the dead wood creates fissures that collect water, spores, bacteria that then promote decay. So I actually recommend pruning paint, and bona fide pruning paint, not roofing tar. Roofing tar is toxic, but pruning paint is a rubberized compound. It'll shed water and keep these cracks from forming, will prevent water from getting into these cracks, and will seal out bacteria, fungi, and yeast that are the major decay agents inside the stem. Okay, so big cuts will also heal. This one took about, you can count the rings on here. There's about 12 on here. It took 12 years for this cut to heal. It isn't the same cut as on the left side, but it's somewhat similar in size, which is why I took this picture. Okay, now, when we're pruning for shape and health of a tree, and this includes fruit trees, by the way, okay, broadleaf trees truly produce two kinds of leaves, sun leaves and shade leaves. So the sun leaves are in the sun, denoted by the light green color. The shade leaves are in the shade, hence the darker color. The shade leaves are usually losers. They don't get enough sun's energy to be productive, okay? They can barely maintain themselves, and sometimes not even that. They'll rob the tree of sugar to stay alive. And some tree species just aren't smart about dropping them. Some are real good at it, but some are not, okay? Cottonwoods are not. Some maples are not. So quaking aspen doesn't keep shade leaves at all. They're all sun leaves, okay? So for quaking aspen, we're just pruning out dead. We're not pruning out interior branches. But if we can prune out the shade leaves that blow a lot of water, we can actually increase the water use efficiency of a tree by quite a bit and the drain on it, okay? So most trees, broadleaf trees, want to be umbrella shaped, okay? They don't want to have leaves on the inside. It's very inefficient. And so if we look at cross-section of a tree of its branches, we have the sun leaves and the outer canopy, and then we have the branches on the inside of the tree that are in the shade. So to improve efficiency, we want to prune out the shaded leaves and branches. And sometimes they're interfering branches, they grow into each other. Okay, so crab apples are really bad at doing that. Most fruit trees are really bad at doing that. And so we want to take those out, and we increase the efficiency of photosynthesis, and we limit the water loss that the tree will have. Okay, the way we prune branches back, I mean, if we're taking branches all the way to the stem, I showed you how to do that. Cut flush to the stem or right on the edge of that swelling. If we're pruning branches back, we always want to cut back to another branch. Okay, and we want to make that cut right next to the branch so that we have a water flow and a sugar flow going by the wound, and that will cause the wound to heal. If we make the cut just randomly in the middle of a branch, often that branch will die back and we'll have a dead stub there. So here's an example. This is everybody's favorite, a box elder tree. They sucker like crazy. So suckers are buds, dormant buds in the bark, and sunlight stimulates them, wounding stimulates them. And so these branches all came in after this branch was just arbitrarily chopped off because they didn't want it that long. So the top of this branch is alive because you have water flow and sugar flow. The bottom of the branch is dead, and you can see how it's split and cracked. This is going to rot, and you're going to have all of this growth on a rotten branch, which is a situation we want to avoid. A nice stub there for hanging your coat or your hat on, again, something to avoid. So some trees, when they grow back, especially sucker back, they'll produce prolific branches that grow into each other. Okay, those are called interfering branches. A tree's architecture can be made more efficient because one branch only needs to go into one area to create its solar collector, which are the leaves. We don't need two branches in the same place, okay? Two branches go in the same place are interfering, so we want to leave the best branch that meets our needs, that's robust, strong, and gives us the shape that we want to have. Everything else goes, okay? So here's some pruning that was done pretty arbitrarily. We got just these cuts were made. All of this is sucker growth. Epicormic branching is another word for it. And so to rescue this tree, we need to remove all the stuff we don't want. So we see this is growing into itself. We have too many branches in one spot. We might want to leave one branch like this one that's going out into a good space and take all the other ones off. So here's a real bad case. So all of these branches growing into each other need to be pruned off. This whole stub, I would take it back to here. And maybe if there's room for this, one of these branches here to grow out, these new suckers, I would leave that to fill in a gap in the architecture of the tree. But you got to look at it as a structural architecture. We only want branches where there's room for leaves to grow. If there's no room for leaves to grow, we remove that branch. Now, everybody's favorite, Russian olive. I happen to like Russian olive. It grows in places where nothing else will grow. But we don't need to plant it where there's adequate water, adequate soils, where we have better things that can grow there. So, but Russian olive is really bad with growing branches in the right place. So this grew really dense, big leaf area, ran out of water. The last part of the tree to get water is the furthest from the root system, so top dieback is a very common indicator of drought stress. Can we rescue this tree? Well, this is a before picture. This is after I pruned it. Okay, all the dead came out, all the interfering stuff came out, all of the lower stuff came out because it's all shaded. So I've reduced this leaf area down to maybe a third of what was there, but that third is producing a lot of sugar. That's giving the tree a lot of energy, and it's not using a lot of water, which is keeping the tree well hydrated and preventing drought stress. And by this pruning this tree this way, it can grow a lot taller. This one will never get taller because it gets that much leaf area, it runs out of water, it dies back. So in windbreaks and shelter belts, pruning is an essential task if you want these trees to grow taller. And Russian olive can grow to be 40, 50, 60 feet tall if given the right pruning. So here's an example I use of a flowering hawthorn. Was in a friend's backyard, so I used it as a demonstration tree. And one of the links that Rose will give you is a publication I did using this tree as an example for pruning. So it'll go into much greater detail of which branches to leave, which ones to take. But it had a lot of epicormic branching, so we have these lower limbs growing into each other, back and forth in here. The tree was scraggly, it wasn't producing a lot of flowers. We see irregular crown. And so the ideal thing here is to prune this into an umbrella. And also the landowner had trouble mowing around it, so I also want to prune it up a little to make access a little easier. So that's before, that's after, okay? So I took out all the interfering branches. I took out all of the outliers on here to make the crown more compact, and it creates an envelope of still air that has high humidity, so it minimizes water loss as well. So I'll go back one more time. So that's before, and that's after. A little hard to see, but you can see it's a lot thinner. But since I pruned it, it flowers. The landowners are absolutely ecstatic about it. Okay, so like I said, I have a publication on this that Rose will give you a link to if you want to follow how this tree was done. Now, the other thing is that I could have done more on this is the original tree before pruning. And the owner wanted to be able to mow around it and get around it without having his hat taken off or poking out an eye. So you look at the architecture and you have to work with what you have. Extreme pruning, I would have taken all the lower branches off and follow these red lines as my guideline. Okay, I chose to use the yellow branches as the guideline, so that's what I wanted to prune it to. And these lower ones in the green zone all came off to raise it up a little bit. But you have to work with what you have. You can't force something onto a tree if it isn't already there. Now, if it isn't there and it's suckers, you can cultivate suckers or epicormic branches to fill a space if there isn't something there. So that's always an option. And most flowering ornamental trees, flowering crabs, apple trees, fruit trees will prune up this way, and they will sucker, and you can cultivate suckers into branches that you want to grow. Now, just a short thing on fruit production. Okay, Most fruit, like apples and pears, apricots, plums, are on 2-year-old twigs. Okay, so the first year the twig is growing, it doesn't produce fruit. The second year it produces flowers, and that's where the fruit grows on. So pruning apples or fruit trees, we use a basket approach. We want a lower basket, so in that case we would leave the lower branches, we would take out the middle branches, and we'd have an upper basket. Okay, and that is to optimize light penetration to both the lower branches and the upper branches. We prune off anything we don't need, but we purposefully will, some of these longer ones, if we want fruit on them, let's take this branch right here, we'll prune it back to about 3-4 inches. We want to leave 2 to 3 buds on there, and you can see where those buds are, because those will flower and that's where the fruit will be. We don't want fruit way on the ends of these that will bend and break branches off, okay? So the number of those buds you leave is going to determine the fruit you have. An apple tree will produce 1,000 apples that are all small and scrawny. If it's pruned properly, it'll produce 100 apples, each of which are big and sweet. And that's what pruning in fruit orchards, or pruning for fruit production, what the goal is. Minimize the number of fruit enough to make it worthwhile to pick and grow, but not so much that they're all stunted and small. Okay, well, what happens if we have a tree that's too tall? Okay, and that happens quite often. We want to use the same philosophy we do in pruning back branches. We want to prune it back to where there are adequate branches coming out, again, to keep water and sugar flow next to that pruning cut, okay? It's referred to as a reduction cut, okay? That's opposed to topping a tree. And sometimes it's pretty hard to tell the difference, and you just don't have something to work with. And again, I'll get into that in a little greater detail. So this is topping. This is where arbitrarily we brought the tree down to a smaller size. The branches got big. Cottonwoods are very common, really lousy wood. It breaks, get a lot of breakage because it's very brittle wood. And this solves the problem temporarily. But with these big cuts, where the water gets pulled back, we get rot in those. And we're getting a lot of epicormic branching on the ends here, so that will turn into that. Okay, so we get all the suckering off the ends of those. And those get bigger, and yet they're attached to an end that rots off, so that water suction draws the water back. You always end up with dead spots when you top like that, okay? And those dead spots create a lot of rot. Here's an example of I did this to a grand fir actually, because it was in the power line, but you can see how that rot has moved into the top of the tree. All these suckers came off the top to build a new top, but they're attached to now rotten base, okay? That's structurally very unsound. You get poor water flow through it. Well, it's non-functional for supplying the branches of water. It's an entryway for decay fungi and also pathogenic fungi, which is ultimately what killed this tree, is the topping procedure. Now, some people, these cottonwoods got too big. They're next to the house, so they topped them once. And so the first topping is here, here, down along here, okay? Then the trees suckered. They pruned them out, and they let some suckers go big. They got a little nervous, so they had them topped again, okay? This is the absolute wrong way to do it, because now you have a decay area right here where the trees are structurally unsound, and you're building a new decay area right there where they're unsound. And so this is the recipe for disaster. Once you top a tree and you get this decay, and like I said, sometimes you have no choice. The trees are the wrong species. Cottonwoods are not, and hybrid poplars are not good to have next to houses. So I understand you want to take that risk away. But if you top, you have to retop every 10 years or so. And that means taking, when you retop, you have to top below the first topping. So you're taking the decay out of there, not above it. So every time you top, the tree gets shorter. And topping is a temporary solution. I mean, if you do on these trees, if you top it every 10 years, you can get 100 years out of a top tree without creating a danger to yourself. If you don't do that, well, you've bought yourself 10 years, and now you have a worse danger than if you had not topped the trees. Hope that makes sense. Okay, so here it gives you an idea of where this is actually an ash tree that had been topped, bad pruning cut. It tried to grow over it, but this was sticking out too far. So you got this big rotten chunk in there, decay in there. It's a structural weakness, and those things then break off. And so when I go visit towns, homes that had storm damage on them, this is typically what I see. About 90% of these top ends will fail in a bad storm. So we just want to avoid that. Another example, and these suckers can get big and heavy. So this thing weighed about 300 pounds. Not something I wanted to come down near me. Okay, so reduction cut takes the tree back to where you have branches on there so that you get good healing of those wounds and you don't get a lot of decay. You're still going to get an awful lot of suckering on there. So that's where I would bring it down. If I need to bring it down further, you get the idea. Here's one that had been more topped. You have a lot of suckers on here. So this one I would retop now past the original topping to take all those decayed ends out of there. And again, you can do this, if you do this every 10 years, you remove the branches once they get too big and get dangerous, and you just make the tree shorter every time. But you can get a century of tree shade from trees if you consistently do this. Okay, so here's a question I usually throw at people. 2 trees that were topped. This one you can see where it was brought down to about along this line that I'm doing with the pointer. This one was brought down a lot further. Which one is a worst case scenario? Okay, I have no way of doing raising of hands, but I'll tell you, most people think this is much worse. Okay, actually, I would argue the opposite is true, because on this one, we topped the tree, and within 5 years, we're right back to where we started from. What did we achieve? Absolutely nothing, except for we now have decay at the ends of each of these branches. This tree would have been much better off. Just leave it alone. Don't top it. Okay. Once you top it, you have to go back to that process. This one, I actually talked to the homeowner and asked him, why didn't you just remove the tree? He said, well, I'm 70 years old. I don't have time to wait for another shade tree, and I want the shade trees, but these trees were too big, too dangerous, so I had to take the weight and the torque off the top, and that's why I did this. And it makes perfect sense. Okay, they bought themselves 10 years of shade. Now they're going to call an arborist in another 4 or 5 years, and they're going to retop it right here, take the risk away. They're still going to have their shade trees. And so this one was done out of necessity. I mean, this is kind of like bypass surgery. You got to do it. It's not something you want to do, but you got to do it, and it buys you a lot of time. This one is like doing bypass surgery when you have a high cholesterol, but you have no blockage. Okay, you don't have to do it because there really isn't an imminent risk from it. It's you can actually culture this tree in such a way so that it won't create a big risk to you. Maybe remove these lower laterals now before they get too big and are hanging over your house. All right.
Hey, Peter.
Yes.
We have a couple questions. The first one is more of a fruit tree question. Any advice on grafting different stone fruit trees together?
Okay, so where you want different plums on the same tree, nectarines and peaches on the same tree, things like that. It's doable. A graft on a mature tree is always a weak area. You get difficult water and sugar flow across grafts, even when they fully take. So most grafting that is productive is done when the trees are seedlings and you graft a fruit-producing twig onto the rootstock of a very aggressive tree that has aggressive rootstock, and then you cultivate that graft as a single stem. If you graft different species onto the same tree, it can work, but generally your fruit production is diminished because you don't get good water flow across those grafts on the tree. So it, like I said, it can be done. I've seen multiple trees that had different cultivars. They have to be the same species and genus though, okay? Otherwise you'll have a rejection on it. So different kinds of plums, all in the prunus family. It will work. You just won't get really good production off of that tree. You'll get mediocre production because each of those grafts is a blockage to the tree, if that makes sense. So you had other questions?
Yes, the other question was, can you talk about pruning forsythia? And did I say that right? It's Forsythia.
Probably not well. It's not a species I deal with a lot. Okay, but in generally, the pruning is the same, though forsythia is more of a shrub than a tree. And so shrubs, it's just like pruning back roses. You want to keep an intact main stem on it, and then it's the new growth that will produce the flowers every year for you. So it's a bit more straightforward. And just take out the interfering branches. You want, just like forsythia, you also want to have good architecture. Don't want branches crossing each other. And you want to be really careful about sterilizing your pruning equipment with ornamentals like forsythia, because there's certain canker fungi that you can spread by cutting through one area where the branches have died back that might have that fungus in it. Now you have the spores on your shears, and if you prune on another one, you've just inoculated that tree with it. So with any flowering shrubs, flowering trees, I'd be really careful about pruning out dead and dying disease stuff, and make sure that I sterilize my tools. Rubbing alcohol probably works the best. You can use a 20% bleach water as well, but rubbing alcohol works the best. So I hope that sort of answers your question. But honestly, I don't deal with the flowering ornamental shrubs too much. I deal mainly with the larger growing trees.
And there's another question. There's two more questions. Is there a way to prevent suckers?
Yes, sort of. Okay. So epicormic branches, those dormant buds, are stimulated by full sunlight. So, and I'm glad you asked that question. Pruning paint plays another role. So if you prune around a wound, suckering is stimulated by a wounding response. The trees produce growth hormones that stimulates those suckers. But light does also. So when you take that pruning paint, and it's usually an aerosol can, it's rubberized stuff, if you spray it over an area around the cut, 2, 3, 4 inches, you can block sunlight from hitting those dormant buds, and that will slow down suckering. So that's the best technique that I know of. The harder you prune, the more hormones will be produced, the bigger the suckering problem. So if you can prune lightly and prune every year to reach your final shape, if you have to prune really severely, then you're going to stimulate more suckering. So, and keep your pruning cuts in the shade.
What about those suckers that are on the ground that are about 10 to 15 feet away from the main tree?
Okay, only certain trees will do that. Silver poplar is one of those. It's an exotic species. It's actually a great tree. It's much more robust than cottonwoods are. It grows wider, but it has much stronger structural strength. It doesn't get the decay. So I do like silver poplars, but they root sucker like mad. And there's nothing you can do. Just mow them off when they're little, and keep mowing them off. You can't remove the roots. You can't spray them with anything. You can try adding a little bit of fill, but if you bury the roots too much, it restricts oxygen flow to the root system, and then you can hurt the root system, and the tree can potentially die from that. But some trees will just do that. That's part of their reproductive system. Quaking aspen is another one that does that very prolifically. And it's a mechanism to survive wildfires. Wildfires will burn the top off of a quaking aspen, and you get 100 suckers in the place of one tree.
And one more question. Is there a way to prevent decay with topping, or is that the natural process?
Well, good cuts that heal quickly, and pruning paint. Now, with cottonwood, hybrid poplars, if you don't have to prune, don't prune. That's a rule. They have very poor defense mechanisms. Their strategy is to grow fast, produce seeds, and die fast. Okay, so getting 100 years out of a cottonwood, you're doing really well. The same with a hybrid poplar. A lot of times you only get 30 years out of them before they have some kind of fungal decay, because most of them are clonally reproduced. So their genetics are identical. So you have certain fungi that are really keyed into a specific cultivar or hybrid that's out there. So those species, try not to prune. But otherwise, good pruning cuts. And so getting right to that issue here, let me just continue on. So here's a tree that had a good reduction cut. This is the regrowth you got off of it. And there was a lot of storm damage, so a lot of broken off branches. And we just made good cuts on it that would heal quickly. And it grew back. There is very little decay in it. And it's a healthy tree despite the damage that had been done because it was pruned properly. So here's that they were chopped back a lot further. And you can see what you're getting. So the harder you prune, the more suckering you will get. And all you can do now is go in there and remove 90% of those and just leave the ones that will develop into a good branch. In this case, again, this was Lewistown, a lot of storm damage, but a really bad pruning job. You can see that a lot of these branches were just arbitrarily brought back to a certain distance, and that's what you got off of it. The tree is salvageable, but it's going to take a lot of work. Because this much leaf area, all interfering branches, what happens, they grow, they die back, they grow, they die back, and you end up with this rat's nest of dead branches, decay entry wounds, and the tree just goes downhill over time. Okay, now that's a little different. There is a practice of keeping trees smaller. It's not used much in Montana. It could be, and that's called pollarding. Okay, these are sycamores in Germany, Frankfurt, Germany, and every spring the suckers are pruned off, and they're pruned off flush with the stem, so it creates these bark-covered knobs at the ends of the branches. And so in the spring, you can see these suckers coming off of there, and those are allowed to grow in each of those trees. I mean, this is a very famous boulevard, and these are just perfect, beautiful shaded umbrellas that people walk under. It's a very popular area. They just don't want the trees to grow taller because behind me are 3-story buildings, and they don't want to lose their view of the skyline of the city. So that's proper pollarding. This is a case I saw in Montana. This is improper pollarding. Okay, they brought it back, but they left 1,000 little stobs. Okay, each of those branches should have been brought back to the main stem. Okay, that's how pollarding works, and those cuts then seal themselves instantly if they're done well, and you don't get the decay issues with it. Okay, moving to conifers, because I got to get planting trees here yet, and I'm going to run out of time. So here's a healthy ponderosa pine, dead branch in there. That's just, breakage, storm breakage. Occasionally there's some small disease issues that the tree can compartmentalize itself from. Okay. All conifers will drop their needles in the fall, late summer. So here's a spruce. The needles that are in the shade or that are old on the inside of the tree are being dropped because they're not functional anymore. So I get a lot of calls at the end of summer, fall, that my tree's dying, and I always ask, is it dying from the inside out or the outside in? Okay, so if the new growth is dying, there's an issue. If the old needles are dying, it's not an issue. This is typically normal, and some years will be really good and the tree won't drop old needles, and then we'll have a drought year and it'll drop years 6, 5, and 4, and then you get this big needle drop like on this spruce tree, and I got called, is my tree dying? No, it's just we're having a tough year, they didn't water as much, and the tree is dropping all of its inefficient needles. Okay, now this is a transplanted ponderosa pine. I showed you the branch earlier with a real stunted new growth. You can see it's dropped all of its old needles because of stress. So it only has 3 years worth of needles on it, and that's because those needles are still functioning. But because it got transplanted, and this is a little bit going to segue into planting trees, ponderosa pine produces a few long stringy roots. So even with a big root spade, you're only getting 10-20% of the root system. And so this tree did not have enough root area to supply itself with water, and it died. Okay, and the only way, this was in a big country club, and they really wanted these big trees transplanted. They spent $1 million on them, and the only way they could do this is by raising the humidity level so the water loss is less. So they had a spaghetti tubing in every tree. I said, run a tube to the top and put a mister on there that puts this tree in water vapor all summer long, minimizes water loss. They did that, and 90% of their trees survived. So spruce to conifers, typically the ones that we're dealing with, spruces and pines, don't produce a lot of shade needles. They want to be in the full sunlight. They want to be cone shaped, ideally. So if you're pruning, you prune back the new growth, and you do that after the new growth extends. So middle of June is you can shear them. In this case, this got big, so they can only prune up to about this height, and they're creating a mushroom. And underneath the mushroom, these shaded branches will eventually die because they need full sunlight. So you got to prune symmetrically, full sunlight. And to give you an example, here's Anaconda, Montana. These spruce trees are the same age. Okay, but these, once they reach this height, he prunes them every year, shears them back. This one is allowed to grow to its natural height. So this tree is only retaining 2 years worth of needles because of the shearing all the time. This has 5 years worth of needles. So the consequence is This tree is a lot more susceptible to aphids, mites, diseases that attack the needles because it doesn't have the depth of needle base that this tree does. But these trees are 30 years old and they've been sheared this way, so you can do it. So there's a lot you can do with pruning. It might not be optimal for the tree, but it's optimal for this landowner who doesn't want a big tree blocking his view. And aesthetics is in the eye of the beholder. Now, again, the trick with all of these, whether it's junipers, arborvitae, spruces, pines, you need to have full sunlight reaching them. So two things going on here. One is arborvitae is an ice cream plant for deer. So this is deer browsing. This is a juniper that was pruned to an inverse V. All the branches being shaded by the top are dying because of lack of sunlight. Okay, so if you want to keep your junipers dense, you can prune them, but make sure that all parts of the juniper are getting sunlight. You got to prune them into more of a pyramid or cone shape rather than an inverted V. Great Falls Rose. This is out in your neck of the woods when Wade was still there. So here are a couple of spruce trees. They've been pruned into these big bowling balls. It's very doable. Though, again, as I said, needle retention is a lot less the harder you prune them and shear them every year. This one got an aphid infestation, and because it only has 2 years worth of needles, the aphids had a much stronger impact on them than if the trees and the branches had 6 or 7 years worth of needles. So there are consequences. Now, another thing about topping conifers, it's different than broadleaf trees, okay? Conifers handle topping very well. Here's storm damage, and conifers, spruces especially, are very shallow rooted. They blow over in the wind. So having a tall spruce tree next to your house is a bad idea because the wind will blow them over eventually. So here's just an example of a tornado in Lewistown. Took the tops out of these trees, make a good cut, pruning paint to help seal it off so it doesn't decay. This is a year after the top was ripped out of it. That is the same tree about 10 years later. That's the same tree 20 years later. Okay, so you can do some reshaping on here because now you have multiple tops, and you usually don't want multiple tops. You have weaknesses where those are growing. So this is the kind of shape you want to develop. Eventually, you might end up with that. Now you got to do a retopping on it. But these trees handle it extremely well. And actually, here the storm did the tree well, this was actually purposely topped. The storm didn't hit this tree because only half as tall as it would normally be. So there's not as much leverage on that shallow root system, which is why it didn't blow over or break off. So there's taprooted tree species. Those are pines, oaks, junipers, western larch. They put in these deep sinker roots. Okay, they're pretty firm in the ground. And then there's shallow rooted trees: spruces, maples, true firs, aspens, cedars. The problem with shallow rooted trees, here's a spruce tree. You can see how shallow that root system is. They're not terribly stable, and when they get too tall, that heavy dense crown catches the wind and they blow over. So in Missoula had a bad windstorm that came across midsummer, shut down the city for a whole week because all the trees that blew over, 90% of them were spruce trees because they have this shallow root system. So don't let spruces get too tall. The other is also water saving. This is actually a windbreak slide, but if you're getting 11 inches per year, that's 6.8 gallons per square foot that gets delivered to the soil. Okay, you need a certain surface area to collect water that's equivalent to the needs of the leaf area. So here you have a leaf area of 10 square feet, 30 square feet, 100 square feet. The area you need to collect water has to be appropriately big to have a root system that can absorb enough water to keep the tree healthy. And that's why we have spacing guidelines for trees and windbreaks and shelter belts. Okay, so drought stress, almost always top dieback. Okay, this tree is watered. This is out in Sydney. It's well taken care of, but relative humidities in Sydney are 5% on summer days. The water gets sucked out of this tree faster than the vascular system can resupply it. So trees are stunted out there. They don't get real tall because they can't supply the top with water fast enough. Jordan, Montana, I don't know if you can see that, but the top third of all of these trees has died back. And that's because when they redid the water line, they didn't do a water spigot to water these trees. The trees are now not getting enough water. They have all died back to a third of their height. And that's basically how far the tree can transport water before it gets sucked out of the leaves in an unsustainable fashion. So Conifers, same thing, top dieback, poor needle retention. And finally, if your top is so weak, then you're going to get all sorts of insects that attack the top of the tree. So these are classic water stress issues. Okay, so one way to prevent this, here's a windbreak. The trees are top. They're made denser, bushier by preventing them from getting too tall. Perfectly acceptable, perfectly good. Actually, in this setting, if they didn't do this, the trees would probably all be dead already because they have too much leaf area than this dry site can support. Okay, let's talk about planting here real quick. And there's a lot to that. And I'm going to go through these pretty quick. So the only part of a root system that absorbs water and nutrients are the root tips. So here's the tip, that's the growing part of the root, and right behind the root tip are these fine root hairs. That is the only place where water and nutrient absorption occurs. So those root hairs live about a month and they die, so that root hairs only develop under this new growing tissue. So if we look under a root system under a tree, a lot of the roots are going to be where the nutrients and the waters are most plentiful. Okay, so this is a natural forested setting. All the nutrients are right underneath this duff organic layer, so that's where all the roots are. Okay, and if it's a taproot tree species, it'll also have roots that go down deep to find a water source. Okay, so every species is genetically programmed to have a different kind of root system. Pines, very deep root systems. Spruces, very shallow root systems. And everything else is sort of intermediate. Junipers are good at developing both. So there's a deeper root system. By the way, this is not how to transplant a tree. Okay, now if you're starting trees from small trees, you have container grown. They're 1 year old. They're grown in 3 months in a container in a greenhouse in a container. Bare root are usually 2 to 3 years old. They're grown outside. The roots are pruned. And then they're lifted in the spring and the soil is shaken loose from the roots and they're bundled, put in a cooler. Okay, clearly the containerized suffer less trauma. They tend to be better conditioned when you get them. Containerized works best with conifers, not broadleaf trees, and I'll explain why. Okay, so this is 1 year. You can see all the root tips in that container, and conifer roots can graft together. So if they're in a big bundle in a knot and you plant them, they will graft together and roots will grow out of them. So conifers can handle this kind of stuff a lot better than a broadleaf tree can. Okay, and there's different containers, different kinds of plugs. You can see how dense that root system is. And mainly on those little seedlings, what we want is a thick stem, not a tall tree, but a thick stem. Tall ones often don't have the vascular system to transport water to the top and they die back. So the thicker the stem, the better on these smaller tree seedlings if you're planting them. Okay, and the idea behind these is you plant them when they're still dormant. So right now, perfect planting time. And then once temperature warms up enough, the first part of a tree that grows is the root system. So once they're in the ground, we want them to establish a new root system so they have good soil contact so they can absorb water. And as I mentioned earlier, most tree seedlings want to have a 1-to-1 ratio, as much leaf area as equivalent to root area. Transplanted trees usually have twice the leaf area as the root system, which means they're going to suffer drought stress the first several years. Okay, so want to look at your soils, what kind of soil you have. So here's one. We got a nice a loamy top and then this layer underneath. That's a pretty heavy clay. So a well-textured loamy soil will be crumbly. It's hard to make ribbons out of it. So you squeeze it together, kind of the finger test, and it's like moist chocolate cake. It breaks apart pretty easily. Whereas clay, you can make these long sausages out of. And the problem with clay is it doesn't allow root penetration. It doesn't allow aeration. It holds water, but it doesn't release water really well. So clay is one of the most challenging substrates to plant trees in. Okay, when we're planting a small or a big tree, and I'll cover both of them, we don't want to go any deeper than the root system is. Okay, so we want the top of the seedling to be flush with the top of the soil. Okay, so here, this is a shovel. You can use a hoe. Dug a hole just deep enough where I can stand up that root system in there. Then I'm going to hand pack soil around it. I want to remove all the grass because grass will kill these little tree seedlings. Okay, grass is a superior competitor for water. So I usually want a square meter without grass for this tree seedling to survive. Okay, and then a little bit of mulch on top to hold the water in, keep that root system moist so that these newly forming roots can grow further out into this disturbed soil. Okay, so there's the ideal planted ponderosa pine seedling, containerized ponderosa pine seedling. For doing bare root, it's a lot tougher because these roots exposed to full sunlight for about a minute will start to die. So we want to hold that tree up and kind of spread the root system out in the natural shape that the root system ought to be, covering as much soil area as possible. You can see I have this heavy clay soil underneath this, but I don't want to dig too much deeper and amend that soil because if I add organic matter, and usually 20 to 30% organic matter is what I want to add, that decomposes and the whole tree will sink into the hole, and that has some implications that I'll explain here shortly. Okay, so we want to spread that out. Then we want to add soil. So this is a two-person operation usually. We want to add the soil and make good soil root contact, pack it in, hand firm. So there we go. We don't want to go any deeper than maybe an inch above the root collar or right in the root collar. So root collar is where the lateral branches come out. Okay. Once we go about an inch above that, this stem needs oxygen. And if you bury it in the soil, it won't get oxygen and the stem tissue will die. And all of a sudden the top will die and no water comes up through this area, this stem tissue. The inner bark will die if it doesn't get enough oxygen. So we don't want to go any more than an inch deeper than the root collar, which is where the last roots come out. You'll see it when you look at it, you see it's very different looking than the stem tissue is. Okay, so hand pack it, no death stomping. Now in fruit trees, this is where they're grafted. Okay, so this is actually an apple tree. Excuse me. And right here is where the bud or the twig was grafted onto the rootstock and the original top was removed. Okay, so you have one graft. So this is a different cultivar than what the root system is, and we graft to very aggressive root systems because we want the roots to grow well. And so then we have the cultivar. We do not want to bury the graft area. The graft area needs oxygen. If it's buried, it'll die. So one of the biggest common problems of planting. Okay, so there's the root collar right there. When in doubt, there's a different apple tree. That's where the graft is on that one. So gently, you can pack the soil down. Watering it in is a good thing with a hose because the water movement through the soil will make even better soil root contact and will fill in air gaps. We don't want air gaps around those roots. Okay, so there we are, staking it to stabilize it. Stake on either side with a loose rope, not tight around the stem because that will restrict growth on there. A loose rope on either side, and you only need that for 3 years. After 3 years, you can remove that. Some people leave that on there, and then the tree grows, and this where it's attached to it right there constricts growth, and you get top dieback because of that. Okay, so move on. Okay, things to look out for is 1, no airspace, especially around the containers. 2, we don't want those loose roots stuffed into a hole where they're what we call J-rooted, because if the roots are in the wrong orientation, they will die back. Okay, the roots know which way to grow because the cells store starch on one side and the organelles on the other side. If they're upside down, it causes the cell to eat itself and it won't survive. So J-roots is a recipe for the tree to die. So don't want to do that. Here's an example, stuffed in the ground with a mechanical planter, root system, all those trees died. Okay, so bigger
Peter,
trees. Yes.
sorry to interrupt. We have a question.
Yep.
Sally says, we have a beautiful little pines growing from pine cones from our pine. How
Right.
can we transplant them safely and when?
Well, you want to transplant them when they're less than 3 feet tall. You can do up to 6 feet, but it gets more difficult. And right now, when they're 1 to 4 years old, say they're 1 foot to 2 feet tall, you want to get as much of a root mass as possible. So I would take a spade and do a distance 1 foot from the stem and do a circle. So you're ending up with a root ball that's 2 feet across. Okay. Now that spade, pines are taprooted. So you're going to then have to do a final cut as deep as you can underneath that to break that root system loose, and you're going to sever that taproot. It's not the end of the world as long as you have enough of that root system there, and then transplant it to your new hole with hopefully not letting the soil break off of that fine root system. If it does, then plant as I showed very carefully, pack soil around it as quickly as possible. You don't want those fine roots to dry out. So in professional nurseries, they'll put wet burlap around those roots, wet sawdust, etc. But if you can keep that root ball intact and transplant, that's the best way to do it. Okay, and I'll actually give you some more pictures here. So bigger trees, that's the kind of the root system we have for the top. If you That's your zone of maximum water and nutrient absorption, the root tips. When we transplant them when they're dormant, okay, because the root growth occurs before the leaf growth goes. So if you transplant them now, the roots will grow before the buds burst, and you'll have better soil contact with the new root system. If you wait till the branches or the needles are starting to grow, now the tree's putting all its energy into new needle growth and none into new root growth. So it's less than optimum. You can get away with it, but it's not ideal. So when the tree's dormant, then just as I mentioned, you want to try to get as much root system as possible. Ponderosa pines are problematic because they have a few roots that are very long and stringy. So you're never going to get much of a root system with it, no matter how careful you are. Spruces, on the other hand, are very dense rooted, and you can get 50% of the root system with an adequate root ball with them, which is why in nurseries you see most of the bigger conifers they transplant are spruces because they handle it really well. Again, pines are very, very difficult. The bigger they are, the harder it is. Okay, so root spades are one way to do it. This root spade's too small for this ponderosa pine, so really minimal chances for this tree to grow. There's a much bigger root spade. So especially the taprooted tree species, you want as big a root spade as possible. And of course, the way that works, it excavates a hole, plunks the ball in there, then you water it in, and you put new soil in there, and hopefully the tree has enough of a root system and good soil contact to grow. But soils are really important. So a lot of yards, you have fill on top of compacted soil from the house building. So that is going to be your active growing zone. This compacted soil beneath it is like growing on concrete. So you really want to see what kind of soil you have to work with. Okay, here's another soil profile. If you're have a hard pan or a high water table, this is depositing alkali material. Water table comes up, water evaporates, leaves all the salts behind. This is a barrier to root growth. So then you have this to work with. And so you want to promote good lateral growth. So the wider the root ball, the better. They're balled and burlaps. Do not leave the burlap on these. Nurseries will say, no, leave it. No, it won't decompose enough in our climate, and it'll be a barrier to new root growth and expansion. So you want to remove the burlap or cut it every 6 inches with a knife so that roots can grow out of it. Again, you can get away with really big trees, but the bigger the tree, the harder it is, the more careful you want to be. If there's wire cages around them, you also want to remove the wire. So here's a typical root ball. Has a wire cage down here, burlap, all this. You put it in the hole, then you either cut the burlap or you remove the burlap and remove the wire cage. Okay, it's if it'll hold together, you can take it off beforehand, but usually you take this off, all the soil falls away from the root system dries out, tree dies before you can plant it. Okay, so many are grown in containers. Some are lifted and grown in sawdust. This is a sawdust tree. I don't like those very much. Your Costco trees will all be like this in sawdust. This is grown in a container, a bucket. So here's a guide for how big, wide a ball you want based on the width of the tree. This is very liberal, or however you want. This is minimum. So if your trunk is 3 inches in diameter, you need at least 30 inches across for the root ball. I would always try to go as big a root ball as I can physically manage. Okay, and they get heavy real quick. Here's one that was grown in a container. If it's in a container more than 3 months, the roots will grow out. Like I said, the tree will grow roots before the leaves come out. They hit the side and then they spiral around. Now for a conifer, it isn't the end of the world because these will graft together. For a broadleaf, this is death. Okay, because eventually they don't graft and they will strangle themselves. Just to go back to bigger trees, you got the root ball, it's in the burlap. Most of what you're going to buy is lifted in the spring, sold that early summer. When you buy it, some are sitting in that burlap for 2, 3, 4 years. You get spiraling roots, so you put it in the ground and then you got to cut the burlap. And in this case, you want to cut the spiraling roots. So this is one I bought commercially. This is actually an apple tree. Been in that container far too long. So I took out my little carpet knife. You don't want to cut too deep, maybe 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch most. And you're going to cut through those spiraling roots. and score the bigger ones, not cut through them because they have a function, but scoring them will promote, wherever these cuts are, will promote outward growth. And so the roots will grow out. If you don't do that, well, I'll get to that here. I'm going to go through slides real quick because I'm running out of time. But you do that. So I did that with this tree. Now I have really good soil right here. My hole I don't want deeper than the root ball, maybe an inch deeper than the root ball, because I don't want the soil to settle and I don't want my roots too deep because the roots need oxygen, okay? So this is pretty heavy. I don't want to manipulate too much. I'm going to use my shovel to wedge it in place and lift it, and then I'm going to pack soil in around it because I want good soil contact to the root ball. Any air pocket will cause roots to die, so no air pockets, okay? And so here's a diagram of what I want, not much deeper, but I can go wider because I want my roots to go wide. If I have a clay on the bottom, I might pickaxe that clay a little bit to create fissures in it for the roots to get into that clay a little bit, but I won't excavate much deeper. Wider, but not deeper. Okay, and then nice loose, once it's planted, nice loose stakes on there. But if I have really crappy soil or I'm building on fill, compacted soil, and I have really bad soil, I will amend out to 6 feet around the tree. Okay, and I need to stake it at that point because there's not any soil structure holding this in place anymore. But I can amend out because however far out I amend that soil is how my root system will grow. And I've been to parks where they had terrible soil. They planted the root ball, and 30 years later, the roots were confined to the root ball. They couldn't grow out into that terrible soil around it. And of course, the tree was very stunted. So don't plant too shallow. So this is a transplanted tree that I got called because it's doing terrible. Poor needle retention, top die back. There's the top of the root ball. Okay, so this is planted too shallow. Alternatively, this was planted too deep, caused the stem to die back. This is decay. Again, the top of the tree was dying, and they thought it was, arborists went out there and said, oh no, you got this disease, you got that disease, and for X $100 I can treat it. The problem was planted too deep, and so I excavated a little bit, and you can see all the rot and decay right there. So it has just, it's doomed. It has such a poor connection to its root system because of that. Okay, so again, another diagram, but watering in the soil after you put the soil in place and you've hand packed it down, then watering it really helps because it causes the soil particles to settle in a little bit better. You don't want to flood it. And then those newly planted trees are often very attractive to deer. Stress makes the leaves taste better for some reason or another. So you want to keep the deer off of them. So this is the tree that I showed you an example of, my apple tree that grew. Good leaf. So overall, really, really happy. And it grew fantastic and produced lots of good apples for me. Now, different trees will grow at different rates. Oaks are also taprooted. So if you successfully transplant an oak or a pine tree, it may sit for about 5 years and not do anything, not grow much. What it's doing is it's growing a big root system. That's just the way they're programmed to do it. Here's an ash tree planted at the same time. It is not taprooted. It's a much more aggressive root system, and you can see much faster growth rate, and it's just species dependent. They were both planted, same size, same root ball, same technique. The ash trees just took a lot faster. That's what ash trees do. That's why we have a lot of them. Oaks, taprooted tree species, take a long time to recover. But once it's going, this tree is now grown at 2 feet a year because it's reestablished its root growth. But you got to make sure that the soil around it is good for it to grow into. Okay. Another problem, and this is the one I really wanted to show you. So these trees have been in the ground for a long time, 10 years. And this one has all sorts of trouble. Again, insects, diseases, all that kind of stuff. And it's being topically treated for that. But here's the problem. Got to look at the root system, how it was planted. So I did a little excavating around it. Started seeing these spiraling roots, got permission to dig a little further. Now I've got constricting roots on there. The landowner was fine with me pulling it out. Doesn't take much to dig these out. That's the root system. That's what it looked like once I washed all the water off of it. And it'd been in the ground for 10 years. Okay, so when they planted it, had they scored this and amended the soil around it, we wouldn't have had this problem. So here's one that wasn't nearly as bad. You can see how the roots did grow out of it somewhat. Again, a bit of a constriction down here from when it was in the container too long. So when you're buying trees, always look at the root system. And to check in the container, just tap the side of the container to break loose the connection, and then you should be able just to lift it out of the container a little bit. And if you see these roots going round and round and round, don't waste your money on it. So,
Peter, sorry, we have a couple questions, and it looks like I got to the questions slide. I'll let you
yep.
complete your thought.
Oh, no, I completed my thought. So what questions do you have?
Peggy says buying 10-foot trees from nurseries in pot or burlap ball. Is it better to plant these in the fall as they're dropping leaves, or in the spring before, when their buds are budding out, when they're leafing out?
I'd rather do it in the fall when they're dropping their leaves, because then you have fall root growth and spring root growth time. But honestly, if you're buying 10-foot tall trees, I've done a lot of trials with different trees. You're better off buying a 6-foot tall tree, because a 10-foot tall tree in a potting container has a truly out of whack shoot to root system. And it's going to sit there for a long time and not do diddly squat while it's trying to regrow its root system. You plant a 6-foot tall tree, you have a much better root to shoot ratio on it. It's going to hit the ground, and within a year, it's going to start growing taller. And in the trials I've done, after 10 years, the trees were the same size. But one had a much better root system because it had a bigger root system that was planted that developed into a much better expansive natural root system. Now, if you need to have tall trees around your place, just realize you got to be really diligent about watering them, and you have to be very diligent about having good soil around the hole you're planting them in, because you have all that big leaf area that you have to support and a little itty bitty root system to do it, and it doesn't take much for those to die if things aren't optimal. It's doable, it's just much more difficult.
A question from Kendall. She asks, are there any general rules for pruning fruit trees? Example, peach, lemon, lime, pear, and oranges.
Okay, are you growing them for ornamental or for fruit production, or both? So if it's for fruit production, you want to keep them short, 2 basket maximum, and
You said fruit production.
yeah, and you want to prune them pretty hard. So pruning stimulates reproductive hormones. Okay, trees, when they think they're going to die, they want to reproduce. Not too different than humans, I suppose. But anyways, so prune them hard. Don't leave too many twigs, but remember that where the fruit is produced is on the 2-year-old new growth. So the ends of branches, the spurs, as we call them, the shorter twigs that are coming off of the sides of it. And prune so you can reach them. So orchards, they don't let those trees get any taller than 6 to 8 feet. They just want them wide so they can pick the fruit. If you want shape and landscaping, then you prune them the way in the slideshow I showed early on, the deciduous trees, where you prune out the inside. You want them lollipop shape. So now, fruit orchards, when they're pruning for fruit, they tend to replace their trees every 5 to 10 years. So they're not interested in longevity. They're just interested in maximum fruit production. It's kind of like dairy cows. You know, you have maximum milk producers. They live for 3-4 years, and then they're burn themselves out. So now you can prune for both. You decide which height you want, how far you want to climb, and you have to continually prune out the suckers every year, because and leave just the suckers and prune those back into short stobs. You know, unlike the landscape pruning, you want to leave 2 to 3 buds on those shorter ones, and don't leave too many. Okay, so each one of those stobs will produce 2 to 3 apples or pears on it. And so, you know, figure looking at the tree how many apples or pears you want, and leave the appropriate number of branch tips and spur branches for that number of fruit. And don't be afraid to prune them too hard.
Sarah asked, is there any way to recover a spruce tree that has bark eaten away or ringed by voles?
Well, if it's a little tree, conifers can take about 50% of their bark removed, and they will recover. If it's a bigger tree, 6 inches or more, that's going to be tough because about half of the crown is going to die back because it's only getting half the water. So you can try it. Pruning paint. I mean, so if it's just happened, covering the area that was gnawed back by gophers or voles with pruning paint will keep more of the sapwood alive. So you're keeping the water flow going. And with good water flow, you'll have good photosynthesis. The sugar coming down will get dammed up by the injury, and that will promote really rapid growth across that chewed off area. If you're at 10 or more inches, your tree is doomed to have a difficult life. It may survive, but it'll be really one-sided.
Thank you, Peter. These have been awesome questions. Everyone's saying thank you and thank you, Peter. If there are any other questions, please type them in the chat. Oh,
So
here we go.
yeah,
That was fast.
I just threw a couple extra slides in there. So be careful with herbicides around planted trees. Some are fine with planted trees, like casseron. Roundup is fine as long as you don't get it on the branches. This has milestone added to the soil. Milestone is deadly on trees, even though the label says it's fine. So when you get this weird elongated shoot growth, most herbicides are growth hormones, and they cause the tree to grow itself to death. So be real careful. Like I said, Roundup or casseron is a pre-emergent. So any weed seeds that germinate will die. Roundup, it's a chlorophyll disruptor. So any leaf it gets on, it will kill the plant. So a lot of people, successful people, use a little bit of Roundup. They use cultivation. They might use casseron, but cultivation. And keep the grass away from your transplanted trees because grass will kill them. Grass is a much better competitor for water. Okay, I already talked about that one. Bigger trees, things you got to be cautious of is, remember, the top is the root system. Here they're putting in an asphalt sidewalk. Well, that's going to asphyxiate half the root system. So they're putting in drain tile and leaving the end of the drain tile open so that there's good air exchange to the root system. And that way they'll keep that tree alive. A lot of big trees die because people add fill, they build a house next to it, they put a driveway, and they kill half the root system. So just wanted to throw those out there as last parting thoughts.
We have a couple more questions. Sally asks, if we have a number or smaller pines from the pine cone, should we plant them now?
I would try and transplant them in the spring. Oh, well, yeah, duh. Now would be a good time to do it. Yes.
And
So-
then Peggy asked, what about splits at the bottom of willow trees? Causes and what do you do for those willow trees?
Okay, two things. One, willows, just like cottonwoods, are just this huge water transport system. They're the tree equivalent to a saguaro cactus. They store a lot of water in their stem because actually the stem then shrinks during the day, and it's a water reservoir for the trees. If you get an early cold spell in the fall, like sometimes we'll go from 70 degrees to 40 below, that's Montana, that water content in the stem will cause the stem to split. Okay, so that's unavoidable in Montana for cottonwoods and willows. The other thing that will cause splitting is if you get decay inside the tree, so rot. And that rot holds a lot of water, and that will split the stem. So you see big trees with splits going 4 or 6 feet up the side of the stem. That tells you that the inside of the stem is decayed wood. So here the trick is that as long as the stem is growing faster than the rot is decaying the center of the tree, it's still a safe tree. If the rot is exceeding the growth of the sapwood, then that tree is structurally unsound. So how do you do that? We have this tool called an increment borer. We use it to age trees. You can also use that to bore into the tree and see how much sapwood you have. And so say you have a 20-inch diameter tree. If you have 3 inches of sound sapwood on the outside, the tree is pretty stable unless the tree is ungodly tall. Okay, and sometimes these cottonwoods out there, they're 120 feet tall, and they're almost every big old cottonwood is decayed in the center just because they have no defenses whatsoever. Okay, if that decay goes out and you only have an inch or two of sapwood keeping that tree alive, it's time to remove the tree or severely top it because that's not enough structural wood to keep the tree sound. So watch out for decay. I mean, if the tree is oozing brown, gooey stuff, that means you have yeast inside that's working with water to decay the inside of the tree, and it's brewing a horrible beer. And that pressure is what's causing that stuff to ooze out. So a lot of elm trees will do that as well. Just to the nature of their architecture, they have V-shaped forks that collect debris and water. But as long as that sapwood is sound, then the tree is stable and good. So again, you want younger trees, not as big of an issue. Older trees, you want at least 3 inches of sound sapwood to keep the tree stable. I hope that answers the question.
Peggy says thank you. There aren't any questions in the chat yet, but if you guys have a question, please put them in the chat. We'll wait a little bit.
So a lot of what I've been talking about is in the 3 handouts and links that I sent to Rose. So she'll provide you with those. They're on our webpage, MSU Extension Forestry. Make sure it's Montana State, not Mississippi State or Minnesota or Michigan State. And if you look on that webpage under publications, that's where you'll find all this information that I just presented to you is there in some handouts for you. And if you're stumped with any questions, my job as an extension forestry specialist is to help the county agents, that's the field faculty, to deal with questions that they might need help with. I know Rose is very good with trees and knows a lot about them, but if there's anything that stumps her, she is not afraid to call me up or send me an email, and I can address further questions on a personal basis. And if they're real tough questions, I get through Great Falls every once in a while. What I try to do is we'll get 3 or 4 people that have different issues, pay Great Falls a visit, and Rose and I will go out and visit you and do individual site inspections and offer some thoughts of what might help you out. Right, Rose? You're still willing to do that?
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to go out. It looks like we have a lull. Oh, Sally says she would love that. One thing too is I have recorded this webinar, so I will email out the link for the webinar for the recording, and all of those links and attachments, I will send those out as well tomorrow for you guys, and I'll put Peter Kolb's email address on there if that's all right with you, Peter.
Absolutely.
Awesome. If you guys have any direct questions and stuff, and it looks as if the chat just has a lot of thank you and awesome and thank you. So we appreciate you guys so much for coming on tonight and being part of our webinar series. The next one will be not next week, but a week from that one. So 2 weeks from now on April 25th, we have Abby Saeed, and she's going to talk about greenhouses. So make sure you register for those, and we will love you. Oh, Maelstrom had 16 total. And they have one more question, so we'll wait for you guys at Maelstrom.
I see a message that they're muted.
Oh, can we unmute? Yep, hold on a second. Let me do that for you. This is some funky thing. Okay, it should be requested unmute now.
I don't know, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
I'd like to know, we were gonna go to the other classes and things came up. Is there a way we can look at the information from those classes?
I can send it to you.
Oh,
I can send that to them.
Perfect. Yep.
thank you.
You can either call me, I'll put my number in the chat too. You can call me or email me. And thank you for sending those on, Maelstrom.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Very good.
Thank you very much. We have definitely enjoyed it and learned a lot. We definitely look forward to the last one in 2 weeks.
Awesome. Well, we enjoy having all of you here.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Are there any other questions before we adjourn? I don't see any, Peter. Thank you, Peter, so much for spending. It's kind of fun to watch your screen because it's gone from light to dark in your your workspace there. So
Yeah, I don't have a light on. It's just light coming through my window. But you know, my daughter gave me a sticker for my birthday this year. It says, "Caution: this person may start randomly talking about trees at any moment." So I'm a little bit of a tree nerd, so sorry if this was a little bit dry on some things, but there's a lot more to all of this. So as questions come up, if you download any of the handouts and you have questions, please just shoot me an email. That's the best way to get a hold of me. Or ask Rose and she can transfer the question on to me.
absolutely. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Peter. Have a wonderful evening and enjoy the spring weather in Montana.
It's supposed to rain tomorrow and then get cold next week again. So, but yes, definitely enjoyed today.
Definitely spring in Montana. All right. Good night, everybody.
Happy tree planting.